How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another Pioneer tier list video. This week, we have a lot of Outlaws of Thunder Junction cards making their presence known on Magic Online. With Slickshot Show Off and Pillage the Bog leading the way, the metagame has shifted a bit heading into the second week of the RCQ season. As a reminder, the data for these videos can be found on my free weekly article series, Last Week in Pioneer, which you can find on thegathering.gg. With that being said, let's dive right into this week's tier list. We once again have no S tier decks this week. We've even started to see the top decks lose a little bit of ground, so once again, no need for the alarm bells of the S tier. Next up, we have the D tier. First up in D tier, we have Black Midrange, specifically not discard focused. Next up, we have Azorius Control, Mono Green Devotion, and Dimir Control. Black Midrange is a new addition to the tier list this week, thanks to Kavrik the Punisher, alongside Dimir Control, which picked up Jace Reignited. Azorius Control moved down from C tier last week due to a lackluster performance, and Green Devotion held solid in D tier. In terms of top finishes, we saw Azorius Control put up 1 challenge top 8, and Black Midrange managed 2. Next up, we have the C tier. This tier is flush with some new challengers thanks to Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and here's where we're going to start breaking down each deck's performance in the overall metagame, the Premier metagame, which again is prelims and challenges, the Winners metagame, which is 3 1s and 4 0s in prelims, as well as challenge top 32s, as well as give you the total challenge top 8s that each deck had. First up, we have Gruul Aggro, which picked up Slickshot Show Off and is new to the tier list. This deck put up 4% in the overall metagame, 4% in the Premier metagame, 4% in the Winners metagame, and only had 2 top 8s, but each of those top 8s converted into a challenge win. This deck has looked great with the addition of Slickshot Show Off in combination with Blossoming Defense to protect it from removal. It's one of the faster decks in the format, and it's one of the 3 major decks in this tier that have gotten a big gain from this powerful 2-drop. Next up, on the same theme, we have Heroic, which has been using Slickshot Show Off as an addition to Virtuoso to be able to really apply pressure in the 2-drop slot. Heroic put up 4% across the board, similar to Gruul, with only 1 top 8. The deck continues to gain percentage, and I think all of the different Show Off decks will start to consolidate, but for right now, we're seeing a very consistent level of about 4% for these new aggro decks. Continuing on that same theme, we have Mono Red Aggro, which keeps up the Slickshot Show Off benefit. Both this and Heroic moved up 1 slot from D tier last week, thanks to the presence of this card. Mono Red put up 4% in the overall metagame, but started to trend down into the Premier at 3% and the Winners at 2%. Along with Heroic, it put up 1 challenge top 8. We have seen in leagues as well as on Twitter, lots of really lightning fast decks from just Mono Red Burn to Wizards using Slickshot's subtype as a wizard to enable Wizards Lightning, and these decks have been putting up lightning fast 5-0s. Next up, we have Quintorius Combo, which stays here in C tier with a pretty solid for C tier, 4% across the board and 2 challenge top 8s. Next up, we have our first deck to come down a tier in Lotus Field Combo. This one comes down from B tier, and with the presence of the many aggro decks we just mentioned, it's not surprising to see that Lotus is struggling a little. It saw 6% in the overall metagame, 7% in the Premier metagame, but only 4% in the Winners metagame, a sharp decline, as well as 2 challenge top 8s. While the deck will always be a strong choice for really confident pilots, it does struggle as aggro starts to take over due to its lack of interaction. The next deck that will be jumping down a tier, also from B tier, is Ensoul. Is It Ensoul has been somewhat consistent and moved up in the last couple weeks, but it didn't really get anything major from the new set. A couple of small cards popped up here and there, but nothing to the same level as Show Off, and it's not surprising that this is not the aggro deck holding people's interest. With 6% in the overall metagame, 5% Premier, and 4% in the Winners metagame, it still showed up with good numbers, but with only 1 top 8, it's a real decline from last week. Last up, we have Mono White Humans, which is new to the list as it had been really struggling in the past weeks and prior to this new set due to the presence of Niftalite, Vampires, Phoenix, and Amalia, all decks that it can contest with but has trouble with outside of Amalia where it's really bad. Here we saw it put up some strong finishes, including a 2nd place in one of the challenges. Humans overall didn't really get anything new, but the new metagame suits it very very well. 2% in the overall metagame and 2% in the Premier metagame, seeing it jump to 4% with 3 top 8s in the winners metagame, definitely worth noting as a good deck to be thinking about moving forward. Next up, we have the B tier, and this starts with Abzan Amalia, a very consistent deck that continues to put up solid results and is a good option, especially as we see more aggressive decks picking up steam. The life game is very helpful, although you do have to be careful about your lack of main deck interaction. With 8% in the overall, 7% in the Premier, and 7% in the winners metagames, Amalia put up 3 challenge top 8s and remains a solid choice. Next up, we have Mono Black Discard, which moves up a tier thanks to the printing of Kavrik the Punisher. It was the first deck to win a challenge with the new cards, and we've seen it start to find its footing in the last couple weeks, and getting a new engine that can really put the game away is a very helpful step for the deck. Also, having a lot of discard and removal, very pertinent in a aggro metagame. Discard put up 7% overall, 8% in the Premier and 7% in the winners metagame, but put up 5 challenge top 8s, putting it very close to the top of the list for non-A tier decks. Last up, we have Spirits, and this moved up a tier as with Discard. Once again, we're going to break it out into Azoria Spirits and Mono Blue Spirits, but the data is going to be for both decks when we're looking at it. For the overall metagame, Blue-White Spirits put up 2%, whereas Mono Blue had 0%, 3% for Blue-White, and 0% in the Premier metagame. In the winners metagame, though, we see those numbers move up as Blue-White put up 4% to Mono Blue's 1%, and combined, they had 7 challenge top 8s, with Azorius getting 5 and Mono Blue getting 2. Both Spirit decks ended up being much better when you look at the winners metagame than their representation, likely as a result of being able to attack some of the more mid-range decks, as well as block the powerful show off, as well as being able to handle some of these other aggro decks thanks to Wedding Announcement and other tools in the sideboard. Lastly, we have the top of the metagame with the A tier. Once again, we have our fixtures in Vampires and Phoenix, with Vampires putting up 14% across the board and 9 challenge top 8s. It clearly remains one of the top decks and isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Next up, with Phoenix putting up 15% in the overall metagame, 16% in the Premier, and 15% in the winners metagame, along with 8 top 8s. It did have a little bit more presence than Vampires this week, but they're still neck and neck in terms of winning and overall result. Lastly, though, we have an addition to A tier, and that's Niv-to-Light. Thanks to Pillage the Bog, the deck moves up to A tier and really put up an incredibly strong performance this week, with 7% overall, 7% Premier metagame, and 9% winners metagame. That's a pretty big jump onto itself, but with 6 top 8s, it clearly stood as the 3rd best deck overall. Its ability to fight with Vampires, Phoenix, and many of the other top decks continues to impress, and Pillage the Bog is an even more powerful addition than players even would have suspected going in. There you have it. That's this week's Pioneer tier list. Good luck to everyone playing online and at their local RCQs this weekend, and as always, until next time.